So function, component, how to configure, how to define, some techniques I explained. Components can be class. We can have a class component also. How to define a class component? Let's see. React class component. Point is very simple. React component, React class component, React class component, class component extends React dot component base. It extends React dot component base. That means when you create a class, so when you create any class, that means class, suppose some name, home, and this is an ordinary JavaScript class. How React will think that it is a component? How it gets the behavior of component? How it gets the behavior of component? How React thinks that it is a component? So for that, to get the behavior of component, it should extend which class? React component base class. It should extend React component base class. Then only this home is considered as a component. It is considered as a component. So it is considered as component. So technically, so you have to configure React class components. And very important, every component which is configured as a class component should extend React component. React component is a member of React core library. It is a member of React core library, right? So it is a member of React core library. It is a member of React core library. So you have to import this in order to use it. You have to import that. So that means now how do we create a component? You see, how do we create a class component? Let's go. And in the SRC folder components, already yesterday we created a lot of components. I will create one more component as a new. I will give as a register component, okay, .js, register component.js, okay. Now I want this component to be configured as a class component. So export, default, all these things are same, right? Default, export, default class. Otherwise you cannot use it in another modules, right? Class name is register component, but it is an ordinary JavaScript class. So how it will get component behavior? So that means it should extend. It extends React dot component class. It extends React dot component class. And how to you access this component? That means we have to import what? React. So React from React. React is the core module. From that you have to import this React. This React contains this React component class, right? We can access that component class and you can use it. Actually, library is built in a very complex way. To explain that library later, I will tell you. I told you that we will discuss the complete infrastructure end to end at the end of React, not at the beginning of React, right? Because once you are good with React, everything you can build from scratch, everything. First, you should know how it works, right? Then you can build everything. So the point here is actually this React, generally your libraries, the library that you are using for React is actually built with a namespace concept. Generally, we have a namespace. Namespace is a collection of related type of classes. A namespace is a collection of related type of classes, and it can have sub namespaces also. That means this namespace can have a class called component, right? It is a class. It can have another class under one namespace. It can have so many options. Service, another class. So now this is the namespace. Under this is a class. Then generally, how do we access this library? We access this library React.component. That means the namespace name and class name. This is the namespace name. React is the namespace name and component is the class name. Class name. Because you may be confused like why you are accessing a class with .react. Right? Because classes in the library are organized in a namespace architecture. So these namespace things you will learn in TypeScript. I will tell you when we discuss TypeScript, we will see namespace. There you will learn how to build a library for React. We can build a library for React. So there you will learn how to build a library for React, right? So this is already built library. We are using it. That is the reason you can see this React is a namespace. What it is importing namespace. And in that namespace, this is the namespace. In that we have a class called component. So React.component is not class. React is namespace. In the namespace, we have a component class. That means every class that you create, if it should have the behavior of a component, then it should implement React component. So this is the namespace and this is the class. So you should know that. So here React core library. So in this React is a namespace and component is class. That means actually it is built like this: namespace React. In that React namespace, you will have a class called component like this. Then we access like this: React dot component. The class is accessed in this way. Actually, there are so many aliasing techniques also. Later you will see that when you learn about TypeScript, you can do. So initially React component. Now this is a component. Now very important, as per the rules of the component, you see here, this is the React component class. When you see the component class, you see this is, I'm just right clicking on this and say go to definition. Go to definition, it will take me to the definition of that component. You see this is a component class. In that component class, you can see this component class is having some constructors, read only, so many things are there inside it. This type of library you will learn how to build in TypeScript. We will discuss about that, right? How to build that type of library that you will learn. So as of now, so what is this React and what is this component? So a namespace and a class. So all the classes are stored under the reference of namespace. Actually, to avoid ambiguity issues, these are all configured like this. Now it is not done actually. So now suppose if this is having this React component is having a constructor, component is having a constructor, then here also you have to configure a constructor. Here also you have to configure a constructor. It is a constructor and it's compulsory that it should use, what is it? Super. That means, remember, this is required if you are explicitly writing a constructor. If you are not writing a constructor, then no need of this. That means if your derived class doesn't require an explicit constructor, if it doesn't require an explicit constructor, no need of super. You don't need to import it, right? It is required only when you are writing a constructor explicitly. So if you are writing a constructor explicitly, then only you have to call, otherwise not required. For example, you see in this JavaScript file I showed you here, suppose you don't have a constructor. You don't have a constructor. You don't have a constructor, but by default one constructor will be there in every class. You just have a print method. So you just have a print method, document.write. So this is base print. Okay. This is the base print method. Now here also you have a constructor. And here we have a document.write. This is derived constructor. Like this I am writing. Do I need to call the base class constructor here now? Not required. Because there is no constructor explicitly defined for base class. There is no constructor explicitly defined for the base class, right? Remember here, when I run this actually, derived class constructor is coming. And when you go to the console here, so the print related issue will come. You see, it is asking this, right? So here, that means what does it means? When you create an object, then you need it. If you are not creating an object for this derived class, you don't need to call it until or unless you create an object. If object is created, it is compulsory to call. If object is not created, it's not necessary to call. See, if you don't have a constructor, here also we have a print method. We have a print method, document.write. Which print method this is? Derived print method. Already internally constructor will be there, but we are not calling it. If you are not calling it, there is no issue at all. There is no issue at all. Suppose if base class have a constructor, and derived class is not having a constructor, document.write, this is base. Okay. And you can see that the base constructor. So we create an object now, let obj is equal to new derived class. And you can see that it is working fine. There is no error. That is required only when you are creating a constructor in derived class. If derived class is not having a constructor, it's not necessary to call the base class constructor. It is not necessary to call the base class constructor. You have to call the base class constructor only when derived class have a constructor. Only when derived class have a constructor. Understood? That means here actually in our React. So in this React, do I need to call the constructor and super? It's not necessary. It's not necessary until or unless you want to use this constructor, right? You don't need to do this. You don't need to do this, right? Later you need it. That's the reason basically I am defining here. Now, what should this class have to do? It's a component now. As per the rules of component, every component have to render some markup, right? How it will mark up how it will render the markup? It uses a render method. By using a render method, it can return the markup. That means here, so we are using a heading. So suppose I said welcome to, or say simply register class component, right? I'm defining register class component. Now this I have to use in my startup. This I have to use in the startup. This I have to use in the startup means, let's go in index.js. In index.js, what we define here. So we have to import that component. What is it? Register component. It is imported from the register component, but this time it is a class. It is not a function, right? And we have to start this npm start. So here we are rendering. Here one more important thing you will see. So we are configuring the class and we are defining the class. Generally, this render method have one point I will tell you. Generally, if it is a function, function is directly returning. So it uses the return, and this uses render method, So let me keep that point here, the component end. One more option, a class component must render markup. So by using render method, Now you can see this is one option. So it says that render method will render the markup, right? But it needs a return statement for rendering the markup. That means we have to return this. So this is okay. This is working fine. That means actually this is render okay. What it should render and in which memory it should be stored. That means this is a method now. It is a method. It is a method. So method will execute this. Okay, fine. But it should return this now. Executing, it is okay. Up to executing part it can do, but it should return it. That means this render method will render the content into DOM. So only when this result is stored in it. How to store the result of this inside render method? That means you have to use, again, here what you have to do, return. That means it should return. Suppose I return directly this markup. I am writing directly this markup. It should return the markup. So you see it returns it. Of course, if you are returning multiple lines, you know the technique. So that means this result will be stored inside render method. This render method will render this into the virtual DOM. What is this render method is doing? It is rendering this into virtual DOM. It is rendering this into the virtual DOM. This is rendering into virtual DOM. What to render in the virtual DOM? You have to define it. Through return, you have to configure. Now, very important here is, here I am not configuring the constructor. I am just using render. Then here you can see there is no problem in this. So you don't need that constructor until or unless you try to use some members of this particular component. That I will tell you, later situation will come. As of now, you don't need to configure a constructor here. Directly you can define this. Now these days, developers don't prefer this. So officially React community don't prefer this. React community says that better use classes than functions than classes, right? Because you know what are the drawbacks of OOPs. Because class is a OOP member, right? So it is an OOP member. Let me give you this one. Example is this. So what are the drawbacks of OOPs? What are the drawbacks of OOPs? No drawbacks. So many are there. So one of the major drawback of object-oriented programming, it will not support so low-level features. If any language is not supporting low-level features, then it cannot directly interact with hardware services. It cannot directly interact with hardware services. That means it uses more memory. It is slow. It is tedious. It is slow. It is complex. It is complex in configurations. So this is heavy on application. So object-oriented programming is not a great language. We don't use this everywhere. We are not satisfied with this every time, right? For example, suppose if generally the main problem with this, suppose you have a refrigerator, TV, washing machines, air conditioners, microwave ovens. They are all controlled with a software, and you know that is embedded systems, right? That is C, not Java.NET programs, right? They are not Java.NET programs. So that means you don't have a Java program running in an AC, right? Because in a small chip, I need to put lot of controls, which directly should control the hardware. Hardware means fan swinging up and down, controlling the temperature of the compressor, right? These OOP languages cannot do. They need low-level features. So that is the reason the languages like C, Python, Pascal are used. At a very high level also we use them, right? So that means for example, like space research. So NASA uses Pascal, Visual Pascal, for controlling its rovers on Mars, controlling its satellites. No Java.NET programs, right? That means they are not great every time. Why? Because from Earth they given a command turn right. After 1 month it will turn right on Mars, right? It will take millions of kilometers to travel and control a device. And you know that NASA lost communication with its previous rovers and launched new rovers. Why it lost communication? Because their memory is full. They can't take new commands. Are you serious? You are saying that NASA says memory full? They can put millions terabytes hard disk inside it? No, they can't put. They have to send a small chip, lightweight, into space. Limited. It should control directly the hardware. So Java program, .NET programs are not suitable there. Useless completely. That means you are using a 40,000 rupees mobile in compared with Symbian operating system, 1,000 rupees phone. You turn on both of them. This 1,000 rupees phone will load fast. It will never hang up. It will respond fast. And your 40,000 Android is still loading. iOS is still loading, right? Because you want features, you have to compromise with size. You have to compromise with speed. You have to compromise with the direct interactions, right? If you have to use features, otherwise this is best. So that is the reason in a real world development process, why earlier people used classes, so not these functions. Because actually a difference I will tell you. That means what is difference between React function and the class component? This I will tell you. We will discuss component. What is difference between React and so function and class component? Earlier, better I should say this, because now you don't have any difference. Earlier, now in React 18 on 17 and higher version onwards, nothing. Whatever was there in class component, everything is available in a function, right? In React Advanced, nobody will prefer using class components, only functions. So official React community recommends that don't use classes anymore, but still they have classes, right? But we don't recommend using those classes. We do recommend those classes in some occasions when we need extensions. Wherever a module requires regular extension, component requires regular extension, then we can go with class. But that's also not required. We have other techniques now. That's what actually people who learned React earlier, they have this point, difference between function component and class component. It's very popular in interviews also. But in React 18, like interviews, they can't ask this anymore. This question is useless now, right? Because in this, we have all the features. Means React function, earlier people say that React function don't have hooks, life cycle hooks. Now class components have life cycle hooks. Class component have state. We have state everywhere. We have state in function component also. Those differences are gone, no more there. But we have to know in up to React 18 how the differences were. From React 18, what is new about the functions? We have to know. Those differences we will discuss tomorrow, right, in the next session. So in tomorrow's session, we will discuss difference between a function and class. After discussing the difference between function and class, then we will go into data binding concept. What is data binding and how it works, right? So this is just to tell you in how many ways we can create a component. Function component, class component, what is difference between these two, right? Tomorrow we'll continue, right?